The relentless Alaskan wind bit through Silas's worn wool coat, carrying with it the scent of pine and an unforgiving chill. It was late autumn, and the gold rush was a fading whisper in the vast white wilderness of the Yukon territory. Silas, a man hardened by years of solitary prospecting, had learned to read the land like an open book, the subtle shifts in the snow, the distant cry of a wolf, the promise of gold buried deep beneath frozen earth. His claim, a desolate stretch along a tributary of the Klondike, had yielded little more than calloused hands and a persistent cough that rattled his chest. Hope, like the last rays of the setting sun, was dwindling. He was breaking ice from a shallow creek bed, his pickaxe ringing against the frozen surface, when he heard it, a faint, whimpering sound, barely audible above the wind's howl. Silas paused, his breath fogging in the frigid air. It wasn't the cry of a trapped animal, nor the distant bellow of a moose. This sound held a vulnerability that sent a prickle down his spine. He squinted into the swirling snow, his eyes, accustomed to vast distances, searching. The whimpering came again, closer this time, and a strange, dark shape emerged from the swirling whiteout. His first thought was a lost dog, perhaps a malamute or a husky, abandoned by some desperate prospector. As the figure drew nearer, Silas's blood ran cold. It wasn't a dog. It was small, incredibly small, and wrapped in what looked like a tattered bear hide. The whimpering was undeniably human. He dropped his pickaxe, the metal clanging against the ice, and stumbled forward, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The bundle was barely moving, a tiny form shivering violently. When he finally reached it, he saw a shock of dark hair, a small, pale face, and eyes squeezed shut in what could only be profound terror and cold. It was a toddler, no more than 2 years old, alone and barely alive in the heart of the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. The discovery hit him like a physical blow, shaking the very foundations of his solitary existence. He knelt, the icy ground biting at his knees, and gently, almost reverently, reached out to the bundle. Remember to subscribe to the channel to follow Silas's incredible journey of survival and unexpected fatherhood in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. Silas cradled the tiny bundle. The warmth of the bear hid a stark contrast to the child's icy skin. He had seen death in the wilderness before, men consumed by frostbite, animals caught in blizzards. But this was different. This was innocence, fragile and almost extinguished, a stark reminder of life's preciousness amidst the harsh realities of the Klondike. He knew he had to act fast. Leaving his prospecting tools, he turned and began to half-run, half-stumble back towards his crude cabin. The child held tight against his chest. The biting wind seemed to mock his efforts, but an unfamiliar urgency fueled his weary limbs. Inside the cabin, a single oil lamp cast flickering shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The air, usually stale with the scent of pine and old tobacco, now felt charged with a desperate energy. Silas carefully unwrapped the child from the bear hide. Beneath it, the toddler was dressed in simple, worn buckskin clothing, surprisingly clean given the circumstances. He was shockingly thin, his little ribs visible beneath his pale skin, and his lips were a faint blue. Hypothermia. Silas remembered old remedies whispered among the prospectors. He quickly stoked the dying embers of his wood stove, adding more fuel until a comforting warmth began to emanate into the small space. He found a clean, patched blanket and wrapped the child snugly, then held him close, trying to transfer his own body heat. The whimpering had subsided, replaced by shallow, ragged breaths. Silas found a tin of condensed milk, a luxury he saved for emergencies, and mixed a small amount with warm water. He gently tried to coax a few drops into the child's mouth. The toddler stirred slightly, a tiny swallow, then another. It was a small victory, but in that moment it felt like moving mountains. As the warmth slowly seeped into the child's small body, a faint flush returned to his cheeks. Silas watched, his weathered face etched with a mixture of fear and a nascent, unfamiliar hope. He had always been alone, by choice and circumstance. Now the weight of another life, so fragile and utterly dependent, rested in his calloused hands. The next morning, the sun, though still weak, cast a pale light across the snow-covered landscape. Inside Silas's cabin, the toddler, now awake and seemingly less distressed, sat propped against a pile of furs, his dark eyes wide and unblinking as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. He was a boy, Silas had discovered, with hair the color of midnight and eyes that held an ancient, unreadable wisdom. He still hadn't uttered a word, merely observing Silas with an intense, quiet curiosity. Silas, awkward in his newfound role as caregiver, offered the boy some stewed dried venison, cut into small, manageable pieces. The boy ate slowly, methodically, as if he hadn't seen food in days, which was likely true. Silas tried to engage him, speaking in a low, gentle voice, asking simple questions, but received no response beyond the occasional blink or a slight tilt of the head. It was clear the child was in shock, perhaps traumatized by whatever ordeal he had endured. The bear hide, which had served as the boy's only protection, lay folded near the stove. Silas examined it more closely. It wasn't just a hide. It had been meticulously fashioned into a rudimentary garment, crude but effective. This suggested someone had prepared it, someone who knew the wilderness. He also noticed a small, intricately carved wooden bird tucked into one of the folds. A simple, beautiful piece that seemed out of place in such a desolate find. It was a clue, however small, to the boy's origins. Who would abandon a child in such a place, especially one so carefully protected? The thought gnawed at Silas. The wilderness was brutal, but it rarely claimed its youngest without a fight. He knew he couldn't simply leave the boy here, nor could he continue his solitary life as if nothing had happened. The mystery of the boy's appearance weighed heavily on him, pushing aside his thoughts of gold and solitude. He had to find answers not just for himself, but for this silent, resilient child who had, against all odds, found his way to his doorstep. Days turned into a week, and the boy, whom Silas had begun to call Kodiak after the mighty Alaskan bear, slowly began to emerge from his shell. He still didn't speak, but his movements were more fluid, his eyes brighter. He would follow Silas around the small cabin, watching his every move, occasionally pointing to an object with a small, inquisitive sound. Silas, in turn, found himself speaking more, explaining his mundane tasks, telling stories of the land, even singing old off-key songs from his childhood. The silence of his cabin, once a comfort, now felt heavy in the absence of Kodiak's small presence. Silas often found himself studying the small wooden bird Kodiak had clutched. It was carved with a precision he hadn't seen among the few prospectors he knew. Its style, simple yet elegant, seemed to hint at an indigenous origin. He'd heard whispers of a reclusive Athabascan community living deeper in the remote valleys, far from the mining camps. They were known for their intricate carvings and their deep respect for the land. Could Kodiak be from them? The possibility, however remote, sparked a new urgency in Silas. If he was to truly help the boy, he needed to understand his past. One cold afternoon, while Silas was mending a tear in his canvas tent outside the cabin, Kodiak pointed to the vast, snow-covered mountains to the east. His small finger traced a line across the distant peaks. Then, for the first time, a word, soft and hesitant, escaped his lips. Nadine. Silas froze. He recognized the term. It was the name for a group of indigenous languages spoken by Athabascan peoples. A wave of both relief and trepidation washed over him. The boy wasn't just lost. He was from a world completely different from his own, a world steeped in ancient traditions and a deep connection to the land. The realization solidified Silas's resolve. He had to find the boy's people, even if it meant venturing into unknown territories and facing the prejudices of a changing frontier. Don't miss the next chapter of this incredible story. Hit that subscribe button to join Silas and Kodiak on their perilous journey through the Alaskan wilderness. Silas knew the journey would be fraught with danger. The winter was deepening, and the routes east were treacherous, often unmarked, and rarely traversed by those outside the indigenous communities. He spent days preparing, meticulously packing his sled with extra provisions: dried meat, pemmican, warm blankets, and a small but potent supply of medical alcohol for emergencies. He fashioned a smaller, snugger wrap for Kodiak from an old fur pelt, ensuring the boy would be protected from the biting cold. Kodiak, despite his young age, seemed to sense the gravity of their preparations, watching Silas with an unnerving stillness. Their departure was met with a crisp, clear morning, the snow crunching under Silas's heavy boots as he pulled the laden sled. Kodiak, nestled securely in the furs, occasionally peeked out, his eyes scanning the vast, silent landscape. The first few days were a relentless grind. They navigated through dense pine forests, their branches heavy with snow, and across frozen rivers where the ice groaned underfoot. Silas, drawing on years of wilderness experience, relied on instinct and the subtle cues of the land to guide them, constantly checking for signs of animal trails or distant smoke plumes. The solitude of the journey was immense, broken only by the whisper of the wind, the occasional snap of a branch, and Silas's own grunts of effort. He talked to Kodiak constantly, pointing out landmarks, explaining the sounds of the forest, hoping to keep the boy engaged and calm. One evening, as they huddled by a small fire, the air thick with the scent of burning pine, a blizzard descended without warning. The wind whipped into a frenzy, driving icy needles into their faces, and visibility dropped to mere feet. Silas quickly dug a snow cave, pulling Kodiak inside, shielding him with his own body. The blizzard raged for 2 days and nights, trapping them. Food supplies dwindled, and the cold became a constant gnawing presence. Silas battled the despair that threatened to consume him, reminding himself of the precious life he was protecting. Their survival hinged on his unwavering resolve, and the silent strength he found in the presence of the small boy beside him. Emerging from the snow cave, weak but alive, Silas and Kodiak continued their eastward trek. The landscape, though beautiful, seemed to press in on them, vast and indifferent. Days blurred into a rhythm of walking, resting, and minimal nourishment. Silas's internal compass, honed by years in the wild, told him they were approaching the remote valleys he'd heard whispered about. One afternoon, as they crossed a frozen clearing, Silas spotted a wisp of smoke curling against the vast blue sky. His heart leaped. It was a sign of human presence, perhaps the very community he sought. As they drew closer, he saw a small, temporary hunting camp, 2 figures huddled by a fire. They were indigenous, their faces weathered and wise, dressed in traditional caribou hides. Silas approached cautiously, his hands open to show he meant no harm, Kodiak peering out from his fur cocoon. The hunters, initially wary, relaxed slightly when they saw the child. One, an older man with piercing eyes, spoke in a low, guttural language Silas barely understood, though he recognized a few Athabascan words. Silas, using gestures and the few words he knew, explained his discovery of Kodiak and his desire to find the boy's people. The older hunter's gaze softened as he looked at Kodiak, and he offered them dried fish and warm broth, a gesture of hospitality that brought tears to Silas's eyes. However, when Silas showed them the carved wooden bird, the hunters' faces clouded. The elder spoke rapidly, pointing to the east, his voice urgent, his expression grim. Silas couldn't grasp all the words, but the tone was unmistakable. A warning. There was trouble, danger, something that made them afraid to venture further. He understood enough to know that the path ahead, though leading to Kodiak's potential home, was not safe. The encounter, while offering a glimmer of hope, also painted a stark picture of the challenges that still lay before them. Silas pondered the hunter's warning as they continued their journey. The air grew heavier with an unspoken tension. The landscape, though still pristine, seemed to hold a silent watch. He pressed on, driven by the urgency of getting Kodiak home, but his senses were heightened, constantly alert for any sign of trouble. The further east they went, the more he noticed subtle changes: disturbed snow, faint tracks that weren't animal, the distant echo of what might have been a gunshot. These were not the signs of peaceful, isolated communities. One frigid afternoon, while traversing a narrow mountain pass, they stumbled upon the grim evidence of conflict. Scattered across the snow were the remnants of a hastily abandoned camp, broken tools, overturned cooking pots, and then a chilling sight: spent rifle casings, undeniably belonging to the prospectors, not the indigenous hunters. A cold dread seeped into Silas's bones. He pulled Kodiak closer, his heart hammering. The boy, perhaps sensing the shift in Silas's demeanor, became unusually quiet, his small hand clutching Silas's coat. As they moved through the pass, a faint, acrid smell reached Silas's nostrils. Smoke. Not the clean, pine-scented smoke of a campfire, but the telltale odor of burning wood and something else, something metallic. They rounded a bend, and the sight that met Silas's eyes confirmed his worst fears. In a small, hidden valley lay the charred remains of a small village, its lodges reduced to blackened skeletons. The snow was trampled, and there were signs of a struggle. It was clear. This was the very community he had been seeking, and it had been attacked. A wave of despair washed over Silas, quickly replaced by a fierce surge of anger and protectiveness. The implications were horrifying. Kodiak's people, likely his family, had been victims of the same greed that had brought Silas to this land. The silent little boy in his arms was now truly an orphan, his home destroyed. The burden of responsibility settled heavily on Silas, deepening his resolve. He had to protect Kodiak and somehow find justice for what had happened. This is a story of resilience, loss, and the unbreakable bond forged in the wild. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how Silas confronts the devastating truth and fights for Kodiak's future. The sight of the razed village ignited a cold fury in Silas. He knew he couldn't leave Kodiak amidst such devastation, nor could he allow the perpetrators to escape unpunished if he could help it. Instinctively, he began to follow the freshest tracks leading away from the burned settlement, distinct boot prints and the drag marks of a heavy sled. The tracks led further into the treacherous mountainous terrain towards a distant smoke-plumed ridge. As they ascended, the air grew thinner and the cold more intense. Silas moved with a renewed determination, his old prospector's sense of tracking now honed by rage. After several hours, as dusk began to paint the sky in hues of purple and orange, he saw them, a small camp nestled in a protected hollow, a crude fire flickering, and 3 rough-looking men huddled around it. They were prospectors, their gear scattered haphazardly. Their faces, illuminated by the firelight, were hardened by desperation and a cruel indifference. Silas approached cautiously, Kodiak held tight against his chest, the small boy shivering, not from cold, but from the palpable tension. "You," Silas's voice was low, hoarse with emotion. "What happened here?" The men looked up, startled, their hands instinctively going to the rifles propped nearby. One, a burly man with a scarred face, sneered, "None of your business, old-timer. Keep moving." Silas tightened his grip on Kodiak, his gaze unwavering. "This boy," he said, his voice rising, He's from that village. You destroyed it." The realization dawned on the men, their eyes narrowing. "So what?" the scarred man spat, rising slowly. "They were on our claim. Savages." The word hung in the cold air, a fuse lit. Silas felt a primal instinct surge through him. He had faced countless dangers in the wilderness, but this was different. This was about protecting innocence, about fighting for what was right. He knew he was outnumbered, but the silent, trembling presence of Kodiak gave him a strength he never knew he possessed. A standoff in the deepening Alaskan twilight, with only the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind as witnesses. The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut with a knife. The scarred man, clearly the leader, took a step forward, his hand inching towards his rifle. "Listen, old man, you don't want trouble. This ain't your fight." Silas stood firm, shielding Kodiak with his body. "It is my fight," he retorted, his voice unwavering, "when innocent lives are destroyed by greed." He knew he couldn't take on 3 armed men head-on. He needed a different approach. "The law will come for you," Silas bluffed, his eyes darting between the men, trying to gauge their reactions. "They'll find this boy, and they'll know exactly who did this." The lie hung in the air, a desperate gamble. The scarred man scoffed, but one of the younger prospectors shifted uneasily, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The remoteness of the territory often meant little oversight, but the risk of being hunted by authorities or even vengeful indigenous tribes was real. Suddenly, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the valley, the distinct report of a rifle from the ridge above them. All 3 prospectors flinched, their eyes scanning the dark, tree-lined slopes. Before they could react, a second shot rang out, closer this time, and a bullet whizzed past the scarred man's ear, kicking up snow inches from his face. The men exchanged panicked glances. Silas knew intuitively it wasn't the law. It was the other hunters, the ones who had warned him, watching from the shadows. They had followed the trail, too. The scarred man, seeing the determined look in Silas's eyes and sensing the unseen threat from the ridge, hesitated. He cursed under his breath, his bravado crumbling. "This ain't worth it," he grumbled to his companions, his gaze fixed on the ridge. "Let's go." Without another word, they gathered their meager belongings, their movements rushed and nervous, and disappeared into the deepening gloom, leaving Silas and Kodiak alone in the clearing. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled his knees, washed over Silas. They were safe for now. He looked up at the ridge, a silent nod of gratitude to the unseen allies. The wilderness, though brutal, had also offered a strange form of justice. Silas, with Kodiak clutched tight in his arms, watched as the 3 defeated figures of the prospectors faded into the inky blackness of the Alaskan night. The biting wind still whistled through the pass, but the sharp tension that had electrified the air minutes before had begun to dissipate, leaving behind only the rhythmic crackle of their small fire and the gentle, steady rise and fall of Kodiak's small chest against his own. They remained there, huddled together, until the first subtle hint of dawn began to smudge the eastern sky with soft pinks and muted oranges. Long, skeletal shadows stretched across the snow, a silent farewell to the darkness that had shrouded their confrontation. Silas knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that their perilous journey eastward, the one driven by the desperate hope of finding Kodiak's kin, was now truly complete. Kodiak's people, if any, had survived the brutal attack, were no longer in the burned village, and their path now lay unequivocally elsewhere. The return trek to Silas's secluded cabin was long and arduous, a physical test after the emotional intensity of the night. Yet it was a journey profoundly different from the outward bound. There was a new, quiet understanding between the man and the child. The vast, indifferent wilderness, which had once defined Silas's solitude, had stripped it away, replacing it with a connection that felt as vital and encompassing as the very air he breathed. Kodiak, no longer the silent, fearful shadow of a child he had found, began to stir, slowly emerging from the trauma that had gripped him. He would occasionally point at a soaring raven or a distant, snow-capped peak, a soft, questioning sound escaping his lips, small, hesitant signs of a budding trust that warmed Silas more than any blazing fire. Back within the familiar if crude walls of the cabin, Silas set about clearing a small corner for Kodiak, transforming a space once meant only for himself. He meticulously fashioned a rudimentary bed from his softest furs, ensuring the boy's comfort and security. He cooked a hearty meal, a thick stew of dried meat and wild roots, and for the first time since their encounter, Kodiak ate with a genuine, unburdened appetite, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his small lips. Seeing that flicker of nascent joy, Silas felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest, a poignant blend of sorrow for what the boy had lost and an overwhelming sense of protectiveness for the life he now held in his care. Silas knew, without a shred of doubt, that his life had changed irrevocably. The relentless, solitary pursuit of gold, which had consumed his every waking thought for years, now seemed trivial, an empty ambition. His entire focus had shifted to the small, resilient boy who had, against all conceivable odds, found his way into his life, becoming his responsibility, his unexpected family. The challenges ahead would be immense. Silas understood that deeply. Raising a child in the harsh, unforgiving Alaskan wilderness, teaching him to survive, to thrive, protecting him from the cruelty of man and nature alike. It was a daunting prospect. But as he looked at Kodiak, finally curled up and sleeping soundly, peacefully in the warmth of the cabin, Silas felt a warmth spread through his own chest, a sensation deeper and more profound than any fire could possibly provide. It was the warmth of purpose, of an unexpected, unshakable bond forged in the crucible of survival and shared adversity. The Klondike, once merely a landscape for solitary dreams of riches, was now a place of shared beginnings, a testament to the indomitable resilience of the human spirit and the extraordinary, sometimes miraculous ways in which family can be found, even in the most desolate and forgotten corners of the world. The gruff gold prospector, a man who had sought only material wealth, had found something infinitely more precious than any glittering nugget, a future inextricably intertwined with the life of a shivering toddler, wrapped in a bear hide. And that concludes The Gold Prospector, a tale of Alaskan survival. We hope Silas and Kodiak's journey through loss, resilience, and unexpected family touched your heart. If you were moved by their story, please remember to subscribe to the channel and share this powerful narrative with others. Your support helps us continue to tell incredible tales of human struggle and triumph.